Look at the name on the fuel tank of this motorcycle. Buell. 5 letters in a plain slanted script, stamped into the metal the way a maker signs the thing he made. It is a real company, and the machine under that badge is real, and the man whose name is on the tank is, as this is spoken, still alive and still building. That is the strange part, because the company that owned this name did not let it fade over a slow decade, the way most brands die. It switched the name off in a single day. On the 15th of October, 2009, the corporation that owned Buell decided in one morning that it was over, while the man whose name was on the tank stood on the floor where these motorcycles were built and watched them do it. Before that name was something a company could switch off, it was the only thing one engineer had to bet on. This is the story of how it got onto the tank and how it got taken back. By that October morning in East Troy, Wisconsin, Buell had built 136,923 motorcycles. At its peak, it had sold close to 15,000 of them in a single year. The corporation that owned it, Harley-Davidson, would spend $125 million just to close it down, and around 180 people would lose their jobs before the winter was out. Those are the numbers. The story underneath them belongs to the man whose name was on the tank, and to how many times he was willing to begin again from nothing. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories of the machines and the people who built them, the ones history nearly forgot. If these machines deserve to be remembered, subscribe and hit like. And stay with this one, because the man who watched his name go dark that morning had already been shut down once before, 24 years earlier, and he would be shut down again after this. And none of those endings was the end of him. This is the story of how Erik Buell put his own name on an American sport bike, lost it in a single day, and refused to stay down. His name is Erik Buell, and he was born on the 2nd of April 1950 in Pittsburgh and raised on a farm outside it in Gibsonia, where a boy learned early what metal was good for. His first motorcycle was a small Italian moped, a 90cc Perilla. He raced motocross, and then he found the thing that would organize the rest of his life, which was road racing, first on a Ducati in the American Superbike class, and then on a big 2-stroke Yamaha, a 750, in the class they called Formula One. He was a national-level amateur, quick enough to run near the front, and poor enough that every crash was a bill he could not afford. He was fast and he was broke. He worked as a mechanic during the day and took engineering classes at night at the University of Pittsburgh, one term after another, until in 1979 he finally held the degree. Then he did the thing that says the most about the kind of man he was. He flew himself to Milwaukee, to Harley-Davidson, and, in his own words, beat his way in the door until they gave him a job. Harley in those years was not the company it is now. It was tired, its quality slipping, its riders drifting toward the sharper machines coming out of Japan. Into that they hired a young racer who treated a motorcycle as an instrument, not a piece of furniture. Buell became a chassis engineer, and a good one. He worked on an experimental V4 project called Nova, a liquid-cooled engine developed with help from Porsche that Harley hoped would carry it into the modern age, and which the company shelved before it ever reached the road. He reworked the frames of the FXR cruisers until they held a road the way he believed a motorcycle should. Machines that riders still talk about decades later for exactly that, praising the way a heavy cruiser suddenly felt planted and precise. He was talented and he was restless, and the motorcycles he dreamed about were not the ones Harley-Davidson was in the business of selling. So in 1982 he left. He walked away from a steady paycheck at the most famous motorcycle company in America to build a single racing machine of his own design. In 1983 it was finished, the RW750, a pure competition bike built for the American Formula One Championship. He made 2 of them. He sold one to another team to help pay for the next. And then in the spring of 1985, the sport pulled the ground out from under him. The sanctioning body announced that Formula One was being retired and that Superbikes would take its place. Erik Buell was left holding a finished race bike and nowhere to race it, a machine that was perfect and pointless on the very same afternoon. Most people would have stopped there with the debt and the empty calendar. He did the opposite. If he could not sell a race bike, he would build a street bike that felt like one, and he would wrap it around the only engine he could actually buy, the big air-cooled V-twin from Harley-Davidson. That single decision, forced by a dead end, slowly turned into a company. His first street machine, the RR1000, arrived in 1987. Its bodywork so cleanly shaped that its drag figure would embarrass sport bikes built decades later. He pulled the mass of the motorcycle into its center, ran the fuel inside the frame and the oil inside the swing arm, and clamped the front brake to the rim of the wheel instead of its hub, which is a great deal of engineering to describe one plain result. His motorcycles were lighter than almost anything out of Japan, and they changed direction quicker. That was the entire point, and riders felt it in the first corner they leaned into. He kept pushing the idea further. In 2002, the Firebolt arrived on an aluminum beam frame that was also the fuel tank. The gasoline carried inside the structure of the motorcycle itself, and the muffler slung low under the engine where its weight would do the least harm to the handling. To a rider raised on conventional machines, it looked wrong. A bike with no visible tank and its brake gripping the outer edge of the wheel, and then it turned into a corner, and the argument was over. The early bikes were built almost by hand, in tiny numbers, sold to a small and loyal circle of people who wanted something no factory on earth would give them. Through those first years, the whole operation ran on that faith and very little money. He had always been a racer, and he built a company that raced. The turn for the business came in 1993 when Harley-Davidson bought a large share of Buell, and, more to the point, opened its dealer network. Overnight, a Buell could be bought and serviced in hundreds of American towns, and the little firm that had built motorcycles by the dozen began building them by the thousand. The models came quickly now, each one carrying the same obsessions in a different shape. In 1994, there was the S1 Lightning, stripped and aggressive, the bike that set the template. 1997 brought the M2 Cyclone and the half-fed S3 Thunderbolt. In 1998 came the X1 Lightning, the first with fuel injection. Global sales climbed from around 8,000 a year at the end of the 90s toward 15,000 by 2008. There was an entry bike, the Blast, a small single-cylinder machine meant to put a nervous first-timer at ease. And Harley did something clever with it. It made the Blast the training bike of its own riding school, the Rider's Edge program, and over the following decade, more than 175,000 Americans learned to ride on a Buell before they ever swung a leg over a Harley. Then there were the fast ones that made the name, the Lightning and the Firebolt, low and loud and unmistakable. And in 2008, the flagship finally arrived, the 1125R, with a liquid-cooled V-twin built for Buell by Rotax in Austria, and a claimed 146 horsepower. The first genuinely big modern sport bike to wear his name. It reached showrooms at $11,995, an American superbike that undercut the Italians and asked to be taken seriously. Years later, long after everything else in this story, he would put that name back on a starting grid at the very top of the sport, the World Superbike Championship, in 2014, the first American manufacturer to line up there since the series began in 1988. Two American riders, Jeff May and Aaron Yates, carried the machine onto a world stage, a tiny shop from a small Wisconsin town lining up against the full factory teams of Europe and Japan. Back home, the same 1190 RX was fighting in the American Superbike Championship, run by riders like Larry Pegram and Corey West, an American engine and an American frame carrying an American name into the top class on its own soil. Nobody expected it to win a title. That was never the point. The point was that the name on the tank was back among the fastest motorcycles on the planet. The sport itself had already recorded its verdict on the man years earlier. In 2002, while his company was still building, Erik Buell was inducted into the American Motorcycle Hall of Fame, an honor that usually waits until a career is safely finished. His was not finished, it was about to be cut in half. Here is the thread that ties the rise to the fall because both of them grew from the same root. Everything that made Erik Buell's motorcycles unlike anyone else's came from his independence. He built for one man's obsession, not for a committee. But an obsession has to be funded, and the funding in the end belonged to someone else. That share Harley bought in 1993 was 49% of his company. In 1998, it bought another 49%, and Erik Buell was left holding 2% of the thing he had started. And by 2003, the corporation owned all of it. The same freedom that made the machines remarkable had handed the switch that controlled them to another man's hand. In 2009, that hand closed. Harley-Davidson was caught in the worst downturn the industry had seen in a generation, and its leadership decided to pull back to the core brand and let the rest go. On the 15th of October, they announced two things on the same day. They would shut down Buell and they would sell off the Italian company MV Agusta, which they had bought barely a year before. The numbers of the ending answered the numbers of the rise. The last motorcycle came off the line on the 30th of October. Around 180 people lost their work, 80 of them on the production floor and 100 more at their desks, and most of them were kept on only until the 18th of December, sent home a week before Christmas. Dealers were left with showrooms full of a motorcycle that could no longer be built. On the factory floor in East Troy sat something stranger still, 500 finished Helicon engines, the liquid-cooled hearts of the 1125, boxed and ready, with no motorcycles left to carry them. The closure cost Harley $125 million. There was no villain in the room. On paper, in the middle of a crisis, all of it looked reasonable. Look at what they did with the Italians for the measure of it. MV Agusta was a storied Italian marque, a maker of beautiful and expensive machines with a racing history stretching back to the 50s. And Harley had bought it barely a year before, at the top of the market, as a way to reach riders its cruisers never would. Harley had paid about $109 million for it in 2008. And in 2010, it handed the company back to its former owner for, by most accounts, a single euro, and then poured in another 20 million euros of operating money to make the problem disappear. They could write a check that large just to walk away from an Italian brand they had barely owned. Erik Buell's brand. They simply switched off. Most men would have taken that morning as the end of a career. Erik Buell treated it as a Tuesday. Within weeks he had started again in the same town, under a new name, Erik Buell Racing. He was nearly 60 years old and beginning from zero for the second time in his life. His first machine under the new name was the 1190 RS, a hand-built superbike free of Harley entirely, made in a run of just 100 and priced at $39,999, a number that named its owner before he walked in the door. Then came a version meant for the many rather than the few, the 1190 RX at around $18,995, a genuine American superbike at a mainstream price. In 2013, the Indian giant Hero MotoCorp bought just under half of the new company, 49.2% of it, for $25 million, and for a moment it looked like the second act would hold. And then for the second time, the floor gave way beneath him. In April of 2015, Erik Buell Racing ran out of road. It was carrying around $20 million in debt, and it filed for protection from its creditors. All 126 of its employees lost their jobs, and among them were engineers who had just quit Yamaha, Boeing, and General Motors to come to a small town in Wisconsin and build motorcycles with him. Hero wrote off very nearly everything it had put in. The finished bikes that were left could not be given away, the 1190 RX selling at half its list price with no takers. The assets were auctioned and passed from hand to hand, bought by a liquidator, then by new owners who promised to restart production and mostly did not. The tooling and the unfinished machines and the rights to the name drifting from one hopeful buyer to the next over the following years, each restart smaller than the last. Twice now a company with his name on it had gone dark, and twice the people who believed in him had paid the bill. What actually survived was not on any balance sheet, it was the idea. The things Erik Buell was once mocked for, obsessing over where the weight sat, folding the fuel into the structure, chasing every last gram, are ordinary engineering today, on fast motorcycles from every major factory on Earth. For most of the 20th century, America built cruisers and left the Sportbike to Europe and Japan, and the whole industry agreed there was no market for a homegrown machine built to attack a corner. Erik Buell disagreed for 30 years, alone, at a loss, and was proven right only after his own companies were gone. The category he was told nobody wanted, an American sport bike that could actually turn, exists now because he insisted on it when no one else would. The used listings measure how far the world came around. That 1125R that left the showroom at nearly $12,000 now changes hands for around $6,000. A fast, strange, orphan machine that a certain kind of rider seeks out precisely because there will never be more of them. And the man himself never retired. Past 60, having watched two companies with his name on them go dark, he went back to a workbench and started building again. This time electric machines under a company called Fuel. The word fuel folded together with his own name. There was an electric bicycle and a full electric motorcycle. The same instinct that had once centralized the mass around a Harley V-twin, now aimed at a battery and a motor. He was doing what he had always done, chasing the next machine, because for him, the building was never the reward waiting at the end. It was the whole life. So here is a question for the people watching who actually lived this. Did you ever own one, a Buell or an EBR? Which model was it, what year, and is it still running today? Were you one of the riders who swore the handling was worth every strange quirk? Or one of the ones who swore the exact opposite? Tell us in the comments. We read all of them. Look again at that name on the fuel tank. Buell. 5 letters a corporation switched off in a single morning in East Troy, Wisconsin, while the man who owned them stood a few feet away and watched. He was 59 years old. He would go on to build 2 more motorcycle companies after that day. The name went dark. The man never did. Next time we go all the way back to the beginning of the American motorcycle, to a man who built a machine that ran on steam and coal, and who died in the saddle of his own invention in 1896 on a bicycle track, in front of a crowd still trying to prove how fast the thing could go, until the next machine.